Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name is Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about the Olivet Discourse, the famous prophecy that Jesus gave about a week before his crucifixion, in which he predicted such things as wars and rumors of wars, the Great Tribulation, the gospel being preached to all the world, the Son of Man coming on clouds of glory, just to name a few. Many Christians believe that these events are still in our future. But is that really what Scripture teaches? More and more Christians are saying no. And I agree with these Christians. After all, Jesus explicitly said that all these things would happen within a generation, which the Bible itself defines as 40 years. Therefore, all these events must have happened within around 40 years of Jesus giving that prophecy. Did they happen? Yes. In fact, there's plenty of historical evidence that shows that every one of the things Jesus prophesied about in Matthew 24 happened by the year AD 70. And I'm going to go over this evidence in this video. Okay, but first, let me start by reading the passage. Again, this is Matthew 24. It's called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus gave this discourse on Mount Olives. And he gave it in approximately the year AD 30, which was about a week before he was crucified. Okay? So let me start by reading the passage so you get the context. By the way, I'm using the New King James Version. Okay? So, Matthew 24, it says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things?'" And he's talking about the building, or the temple building. "Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famine, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginnings of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended. They will betray one another and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who is on the rooftop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen from the beginning of the world, even until now, nor shall ever be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise up and show great signs and wonders and deceive even possibly the elect. See, I told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, 'Go, he is in the desert,' do not go. Or if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the inner room,' do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. The tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet. They will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know summer is near. So you also, when you see these things, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." End quote. Again, this is Matthew 24, verses 1 through 34. So many Christians believe that these events are still future. But as I'm going to show, they happened in the first century. First, notice what Jesus said in verse 34. Quote, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." As Jesus said, all these things would happen within a generation, which the Bible itself defines as 40 years. You can read this in Hebrews 3, verses 8 to 10, or Numbers 14, verses 30 to 34, or Nehemiah 9, verse 21. Therefore, all these things must have happened within a generation of Jesus making this prophecy. Jesus gave this prophecy in approximately the year 80-30, so it must have happened by approximately 80-70. Now, some people try to get around this timing indicator by saying that this generation actually means whatever generation happens to be alive when these things happen. It is that generation that would witness these things, as the argument goes. But that won't work. First, Jesus did not say that generation will witness these events. He said this generation, the generation that Jesus was addressing. If Jesus believed that these events were going to happen thousands of years later, he would have said that generation, not this generation. Secondly, one of all these things that Jesus said would happen in verse 34 was the destruction of the temple, as I just read in verse 2. And historians all agree that the temple was destroyed in the year 80-70, exactly when Jesus said it would be. Therefore, the rest of all these things must have happened then too. These events cannot be divided up. Jesus did not say some of these events would happen within, this generation. He said all these things will happen. So these events cannot be divided up. So whenever the temple was destroyed is when the rest of all these things had to have happened. And we know the temple was destroyed in the year 80-70. One reason some Christian commentators don't want to accept that these things happened is because it does not fit their traditions. So they try to get around Jesus' plain words with these kinds of eisegetical arguments. But they don't work for the reasons that I just mentioned. Besides, there's all kinds of historical evidence that proves that the events all happened in the first century, which I'm going to go over right now. For example, Jesus said, "Not one stone of the temple will be left upon another." Did this happen? Yes, as I already mentioned. All historians agree that it happened in 80-70 when the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. Now, by the way, some atheists sometimes say that part of the temple, which is called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, is still standing. So Jesus was wrong. After all, Jesus said, "Not one stone will be left upon another." But that's not really that's not a good argument. After all, the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall is not really part of the temple proper. It's kind of the outside perimeter. So Jesus was not wrong. But even if, Jesus was using hyperbole, clearly the temple was destroyed. I mean, it was laid waste. It could not be more destroyed. So either way, however you want to look at it, Jesus was absolutely right about that. Okay, now moving on to verse 3, which talks about Jesus' coming and the end of the age. As I just read, right after Jesus said the temple would be destroyed in verse 2, the disciples asked in verse 3, quote, "Tell us, when will these things be, and when will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Or what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Regarding the coming aspect, the reason why the disciples automatically thought coming of the Lord right after Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple is because such a destruction or judgment equated to a coming of the Lord. God the Father came on clouds many times in the Old Testament. and it equated to judgment and destruction. And you can see this in Isaiah 13, verse 9 to 11, or Isaiah 19, verse 1, or Micah 1, verse 3 to 4, just to name a few. So when Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, the disciples automatically thought coming of the Lord, and they wanted to know when it would happen. By the way, for more about this topic, check out my video called What is a Coming of the Lord? I'll leave it in the video notes below if you're interested. Okay, so right after Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, the disciples asked about the coming of the Lord. And the reason is because such a judgment or destruction equated to a coming of the Lord. Okay, so they also asked about the end of the age. And the reason they asked about the end of the age, after Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, is because without a temple, the Old Covenant age is essentially over. I mean, without a temple, less than 1/3 of the Old Covenant's 613 requirements can be kept. Jews could not sacrifice animals without a temple. They could not do their mandatory 3 temple visits per year. They would not be able to keep their priestly requirements, and on and on and on. So without a temple, less than 1/3 of the Old Covenant 613 requirements can be kept. So when Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, the disciples automatically thought end of the age, or end of the Old Covenant age, and they wanted to know when it would happen. Now, something that people sometimes bring up is that the King James version of this passage, Matthew 21, verse 3, the disciples ask about the end of the world, not the end of the age. However, that's not the most accurate interpretation. The Greek word aionios, if I'm pronouncing it right, which is translated world in the King James version, literally means age. That's why newer Bible versions, such as the New King James Version, translates it age. That's the literal, translation of that Greek word. So the disciples were asking about the end of the Old Covenant age. They were, or I guess you can say they were asking about the end of the Old Covenant world, but it's not the world as in the planet. They were asking about the end of the Old Covenant world, or the Old Covenant age. And that, in fact, did end in the year AD 70 when the temple was destroyed. Okay, so let's move on to verse 4. When Jesus talks about false messiahs, he said, quote, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." By the way, he also talked about false messiahs in verse 23. Okay, so did this happen? Absolutely. In fact, the New Testament itself mentions many false messiahs in the first century. For example, there was Simon the sorcerer who, quote, astonished the people of Samaria, and you can read about them in Acts 8, you can read about him in Acts 8, verse 9 to 10. There was also the Egyptian who led 4,000 men into the wilderness. You can read about him in Acts 21, verse 38. There was also Theudas, who led about 400 men after him. And there was also Judas of Galilee, who drew away many people after him. You could read about these guys in Acts 5, verses 33 to 39. Paul also describes false messiahs and deceitful workers transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. You can read about these guys in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13. John, too, said there were many false prophets running around in this time period in approximately the year AD 60. And you can read about this in 1 John 4, verse 1. So there were plenty of false messiahs running around, prior to the destruction of the temple. The first century historian Josephus also affirmed that there were many false messiahs who, quote, deceived and deluded the people under pretense of divine inspiration, but were really just trying to procure innovations and changes of the government. And these prevailed with the multitudes to act like madmen and went before them into the wilderness as pretending that God would show them signals of liberty, end quote. This is from Josephus' book, War of the Jews, book 2, chapter 13, paragraph 4 to 5. So Josephus, the first century historian, confirms there were many false messiahs running around during this time period. Now, why were there so many false messiahs? One reason is that the Jews of that day desperately wanted to get out from under the rule of the Romans. So they followed after anybody who claimed that they could bring this to pass. And secondly, there was widespread belief in the first century that the long-awaited Messiah was due to come. The first century historians Tacitus and Josephus both confirm this in their writings. And why were there so many people who believed that Messiah would come during this time period? Because of the Old Testament prophecies. The book of Daniel foretold that Messiah would come within 490 years of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. And this decree was given around 400 to 500 BC. So the Messiah was expected to come at any moment. And as a result, there were many false messiahs, pretending to be the real Messiah. By the way, for more about Daniel's prophecy, the 70 weeks prophecy, check out my article called Daniel's 70 Weeks Prophecy. I'll put it in the video notes below if you're interested. Okay, so moving on to verse 6, Jesus talked about wars and rumors of wars. Now, what's fascinating about this prophecy is that when Jesus uttered it, in approximately the year 80-30, the Roman Empire had been in relative peace for the last 100 years. In fact, this time period is known by historians as the Pax Romana, which is Latin for Roman peace. Yet in the midst of this peace, Jesus predicted wars and rumors of wars and, destruction within a generation, no less. And it came to pass exactly how Jesus prophesied. Within the lifetimes of the apostles, wars were being fought from one end of the Roman Empire to the other. In the Annals of Tacitus, it documents the many wars of this period. Tacitus uses phrases such as, quote, disturbances in Germany, quote, commotions in Africa, quote, commotions in Thrace, quote, insurrections in Gaul, quote, intrigues among the Parthians, quote, the war in Britain, and, quote, the war in Armenia. So wars were being fought from one end of the Roman Empire to the other within the lifetimes of Jesus' apostles. And by the way, I got this from Gary DeMar's book, End Times Fiction, page 77. So wars and rumors of wars happened within a generation, just like Jesus predicted. Okay, so let's move on to verse 14. Jesus said, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached into all the world as a witness to all nations. Did this happen? Yes. In fact, in approximately the year 80-58, Paul said the gospel had gone out to, quote, the ends of the world. And you can read this in Romans 10, verse 18. And in Romans 16, verse 26, Paul said the gospel had gone out to all nations. You can read this in Romans 16, verse 26. By the way, these are the exact same Greek words that Jesus used in the passage that I'm discussing, the Olivet Discourse. Paul also said in approximately the year 80-60 that the gospel had gone out to, quote, all the world. And you can read this in Colossians 1, verse 6. And he said it had gone out to every creature. And you can read this in Colossians 1, verse 23. Paul also said that the gospel had gone out to all the earth in Romans 10, verse 18. So Paul said the gospel had gone out to the ends of the earth, to all nations, to all the world, to all creation, and to all the earth. And he said this before the year 80-70. So how do we make sense of this? I mean, we know the gospel hadn't literally gone out to the entire planet. In fact, it still hasn't. Here's how we make sense of this. The Greek word translated world in Matthew 24:14, which is, where Jesus said the gospel would go out to all the world. That Greek word for world is oikoumene, and it often refers to the Roman Empire as opposed to the entire planet. This is easy to see in Luke 2, verses 1-2, which says, quote, and it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world, same Greek word, oikoumene, should register. And it's talking about being registered for the census, end quote. Now, this is Luke 2, verse 1-2. Now, ask yourself, did this census of all the world include the Chinese or the Aborigines in Australia or the East Africans? Obviously not, even though the Romans knew these people existed. Caesar Augustus's world consisted of the nations within the Roman Empire. And this is what Jesus and Paul were referring to also when they said that the gospel had gone in out to all the world, or when Jesus said it would go out to all the world. They're referring to the Roman Empire. And by the way, we too often use the word world in the same non-literal way. I mean, how many times have we heard people say, has the whole world gone mad after we hear about a bunch of people doing stupid things? Or, we often hear people say, she rocked my world. Now, we use these same kinds of hyperbole as the Hebrews did. We don't literally mean she rocked the entire planet. We mean she rocked my world. So the gospel had, in fact, gone out to all the world and all the nations by the year 80-70, just like Jesus said, or within this generation, just like Jesus said. By the way, there's a lot more I can say about this topic, and in fact, I made an entire video called The Great Commission Fulfilled. I'll put a link to that video too in the video notes below if you're interested. Okay, so moving on, in verse 15, Jesus predicted the abomination of desolation. Quote, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, so was this fulfilled? Yes. The term abomination of desolation literally means the abomination that causes desolation. This term struck terror into the hearts of the Jews in Jesus' day. It induced thoughts of 2 centuries earlier when the Greek Hellenistic king Antiochus Epiphanes had defiled the Jewish temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar. And the reason why God had allowed this desecration to happen back then was, and it happened at 168 BC, by the way. So the reason God allowed this to happen back then was because of Israel's gross religious failures. So when Jesus mentioned the abomination of desolation in the Olivet Discourse, it meant that Israel was once again guilty of gross religious failure, and that the temple was once again going to be desolated or desecrated. And it, in fact, was desolated in the year 80-70. In fact, not one stone of it remained upon another, just like Jesus said. So what exactly does the abomination of desolation refer to? There are 3 popular views that I'll quickly mention. The first is that some say it refers to the Jewish zealots who desecrated the temple just before it was destroyed. According to Josephus, the Jewish zealots of that day obtained possession of the temple in approximately the year 80-67 to 68, and they made the holy place, or the most holy place, a garrison or a stronghold of their, quote, tyrannous and lawless rule, while the better priests looked on from afar and wept tears of horror, end quote. This is from, Gary DeMar's book, End Times Fiction, by the way, page 84. So proponents of this view say that these zealots who, took over the temple were the abomination of desolation. That's one view. The second possibility is that the abomination of desolation refers to the Roman armies who, after they captured Jerusalem, walked about the outer court of the temple with their pagan symbols lifted high. Again, this is from Gary DeMar's book, page 84. So with the temple engulfed in flames, the Roman armies offered sacrifices to their pagan gods. This was the abomination of desolation, according to proponents of that view. The third possibility, which I think is the correct one, is that the abomination of desolation refers to the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day. They were the abomination that caused God to desolate or to destroy the temple. In fact, Jesus had called the Jewish leadership of his day everything from hypocrites, and you can read this in Matthew 23, verse 13. He called them fools. You can read this in Matthew 23, verse 17. He called them blind guides in Matthew 23, verse 24. He called the Jewish leaders whitewashed tombs in verse 27. He called them murderers in verse 31, and he called them broods of vipers in verse 33. Again, you can read this in Matthew 23. The whole chapter basically is one big condemnation of the Jewish leadership of that day. Moreover, Jesus called the Jewish temple, quote, a den of thieves in Matthew 21, verse 12 to 13, and he called it desolate or God-forsaken in Matthew 23, verse 38. So, as I noted earlier, the literal definition of abomination of desolation is the abomination that causes desolation, and this fits well with the Jewish leadership of Jesus' day perfectly. Their abominations, such as killing Jesus and persecuting his apostles, caused God to desolate or destroy their temple, and God used the Romans to do it. There's a lot more I can say about this topic too. In fact, I have an entire video about it also, which I'll leave in the video notes below. It's called The Abomination of Desolation Fulfilled, so check that out if you're interested. All right, moving on to verse 21. And by the way, I'm skipping over some stuff for time's sake, but I'm trying to hit all the major events. Okay, so verse 21, Jesus talked about, quote, the Great Tribulation, such as not been seen from the beginning of the world up until now, no, nor shall ever be, end quote. So this is Matthew 24, verse 21. So did the Great Tribulation happen? Yes. In fact, by the time Revelation was written in approximately the year 8065, this tribulation had already begun. In fact, the writer of Revelation, John, said that he was, quote, a brother and companion in the tribulation. You can read this in Revelation 1, verse 9. So the tribulation that Jesus said back in the year 8030, would happen within a generation, had already begun happening when John wrote Revelation in the year 8065. The first century historian Josephus also documented that it happened. He said that over 1.1 million Jews were killed, another 97,000 were taken into slavery. The city of Jerusalem and the temple were utterly destroyed in AD 70. It was a bloodbath for the Jews. Here's a couple quotes from Josephus about this event. Quote, it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world are not so considerable as those of the Jews. This makes it impossible for me to contain my lamentations, end quote. And I got this quote, by the way, from the book Beyond Creation Science, page 51. The reason, by the way, that Josephus said this is because of the brutality of the Romans toward the Jews. They crucified so many Jews that they got bored of it and eventually began crucifying them sideways. They were a sick bunch. Here's another quote from Josephus. Quote, it is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was from the beginning of the world, end quote. Again, this is from Beyond Creation Science, page 62. So Josephus and Jesus' words were eerily similar. They both said, that this was the greatest ever tribulation. Now, a possible objection. Some commentators say that this could not have been the Great Tribulation. After all, more people died in the Holocaust. And I want to make 3 points about this. First, it's true that more Jews died in the Holocaust than during the judgment in AD 70. However, the Holocaust was not a biblically prophesied about judgment from God. The Holocaust happened because an evil madman named Hitler, hated Jews and tried to wipe them off the face of the earth. The judgment in AD 70, on the other hand, was a biblically prophesied about judgment from God, which, happened because of Israel's long history of killing God's prophets, and eventually they killed the Messiah himself, and they persecuted his apostles. And you can read this in Matthew 21, verse 33 to 34, Matthew 21, verses 33 to 45. You can also read it in Matthew 23, verses 29 to 36. And then you can also see this in Matthew 22, verse 7. So that's why the judgment happened. This great tribulation happened because of the Jews' long history of killing God's prophets and then killing the Messiah and then persecuting his apostles. Secondly, the judgment in AD 70 entailed much more than simply loss of life, as tragic as that was. God also took away the kingdom from Israel and gave it to a new nation called the church. And you can read this in Matthew 21, verse 43, and 1 Peter 2, verse 9. So this judgment in AD 70 was much more than just a, loss of life, as tragic as that was. God also put an end in AD 70 to the nation of Israel's unique and privileged status before God. From that point forward, God would treat Jews just like any other group of people. Jews can certainly still have a relationship with God, but they must turn to Christ to do it, just like anybody else. It's technically still true, by the way, that whoever blesses Israel will be blessed of God, as it says in Genesis 12, verse 3. However, from AD 70 forward, true Israel is a spiritual entity consisting of believers in Christ. And you can read this in Galatians chapter 3, verse 29, or Galatians 6, verse 16, or Romans 2, verses 28 to 29. So those are true Jews, those who, worship Christ, or those who follow Christ. That's what a true Jew is today, or true Israel. Okay, third point I want to make. By describing the judgment in AD 70 as the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be, Jesus was warning the Jews of his day, who knew the book of Daniel well, that Daniel's prophecy of the greatest tribulation ever was about to be fulfilled. Let me compare Jesus' words to Daniel's. Jesus said, "There will be great tribulation such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be." And this is from Matthew 24, verse 21. Now, compare that to what Daniel said in, approximately 600 years earlier. Daniel said, "There shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation." And you can read this in Daniel 12, verse 1. So Daniel and Jesus are describing the same event. They both mention the greatest tribulation ever, and there can only be one of these, right? Logically. Moreover, the context of these two passages proves they refer to the same event. Both mention all the same descriptive elements. As I just read, both mention the greatest tribulation that ever was or ever will be. They both also talk about the end of the age, or the time of the end, and you can read this in Matthew 24, verses 3, verses 14, and verses 34, and then compare that to Daniel 12, verses 4 and verse 9. They both also talk about the end of sacrifices, or the destruction of the temple, and you can read this in Daniel 12, verse 11, and then compare that with Matthew 24, verses 1 to 2. And then they also both talk about the Abomination of Desolation. You can read this in Daniel 12, verse 11, and then you can also compare that with Matthew 24, verses 15 and 34. So this is the same event. Jesus and Daniel are prophesying about the same event. In fact, right after Jesus talked about the Abomination of Desolation in Matthew 24, he specifically said, quote, "as spoken by Daniel." So Jesus and Daniel were clearly describing the same event. And the reason Jesus quoted this prophecy from Daniel is because it was finally being fulfilled. In other words, the worst tribulation that ever was or ever will be was about to be fulfilled within a generation, as Jesus said. And did it happen? Yes, absolutely. During the Jewish-Roman War of AD 67 to 70. One more point I want to make about this. If the Great Tribulation has not happened yet, then that means Jesus is coming one day in judgment. But Jesus said the reason for this judgment was because Israel had killed God's prophets and his apostles and even the Messiah himself. And again, you can read this in Matthew 21, verses 33 to 45, or you can also read it in Matthew 23, verse 29 to 36. Yet the Jews today have nothing to do with any of that. The Jews who killed Jesus and the prophets died off long ago. It's true that Jews today as a whole reject Christ, but so do most other countries as a whole. So why would God single out the Jews? Moreover, God specifically said, quote, a son will not bear the iniquity of his father. And you can read this in Ezekiel 18, verse 20, which means God would not punish Jews today for something that their ancestors did. Furthermore, God already has punished the Jews. In the year 70, he destroyed their city, he destroyed their temple. 1.1 million Jews were killed. Another 97,000 were taken into slavery. So this judgment already happened. God already punished the Jews for, killing the Messiah and, persecuting the prophets. So why would he do so again? Singling out the Jews for judgment would make no sense. This judgment had to have happened in the first century per Jesus, and it did. Okay, moving on. Then in verse 29, Jesus said, quote, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. End quote. Has this happened? Yes. While this kind of apocalyptic language may sound to us in the 21st century like it's describing the end of the world, this same kind of apocalyptic language was used all through the Old Testament, and it never meant the end of the world. For example, Isaiah prophesied, quote, behold, the day of the Lord comes cruel, with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. He will destroy the sinners from it, for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened and going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for its iniquity. Therefore I will shake the heavens and earth, and I move her out of the place. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. End quote. This is Isaiah 13, verses 9 to 19. So as this passage itself says, the sun, moon, and stars will lose their light. And this judgment happened in approximately 500 BC. It's a judgment against Babylon. So this prophecy had to have been fulfilled before 500 BC. In another example, Old Testament example, this time a prophecy about the judgment of Egypt, God said, quote, when I extinguish you, I will cover the heavens and darken the stars. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon will not give its light. All the shining lights in heaven I will darken over you, and will set darkness on your land when I make Egypt a desolation. End quote. So this was a prophecy that was fulfilled in 580 BC. And once again, we see the same kind of apocalyptic language, the sun, moon, and stars growing dim. And it did not refer to the end of the world. So when Jesus uses the same kind of apocalyptic language in the Olivet Discourse, it does not mean the end of the world either. It was describing the judgment of Israel, and God used this, apocalyptic language that the Jews of his day would have been familiar with from the Old Testament. He uses the exact same kind of language that they would have understood. So when he used this kind of language, the Jews of that day would have understood judgment is coming. In fact, a hard, intense judgment is coming. And it did happen, by the way. Okay, moving on to verse 30. Jesus said that, quote, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, end quote. Has this happened? Yes. To begin with, the term coming on clouds is typical Jewish apocalyptic language. It's judgment language. In fact, God the Father used this very same language all throughout the Old Testament. And again, just like with the sun, moon, and stars growing dim, it did not mean the end of the world. Although it probably felt like that for those on the receiving end of the judgment. For example, Isaiah prophesied, quote, behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and will come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will totter in its presence, and the heart of Egypt will melt in its midst. This is Isaiah 19, verse 1. As this passage says, this cloud coming was a judgment against Egypt. And in fact, in the next chapter, Isaiah 20, it says God used Sargon, the king of Assyria, to carry it out. So this cloud coming happened in approximately 700 BC. In another example, Psalms 18 talks about God the Father's cloud coming. It says, quote, God bowed the heavens also and came down with darkness under his feet and thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him and thick clouds passed with hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord thundered from heaven. This is Psalms 18 verses 7 to 17. So this cloud coming happened in around 1000 BC when God saved David from Saul. If you guys remember, Saul was chasing David all around, and God saved David. And David called this a cloud coming. He described it as a cloud coming. So this is the exact same kind of language Jesus used in the Olivet Discourse when describing his judgment of Israel. And since it was not literal in the Old Testament examples, it would not be literal in Jesus' case either. Okay, so as you can see, the things that Jesus said would happen within a generation or 40 years did in fact happen by the year AD 70. The temple was destroyed, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, false messiahs came, the gospel was preached to all the world and to all nations, wars and rumors of wars happened, the abomination of desolation happened, the sun, moon, and stars grew dim, and Jesus came on clouds of glory. Now, while I did not go over every single thing Jesus mentioned, in Matthew 24, for time's sake, I left some things out. But I did hit all the major prophecies, and I showed that they all happened within a generation, just like Jesus said they would. For a more in-depth study of the Olivet Discourse, by the way, get my book, The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled, which should be available in a couple weeks, I'm hoping. I go over in detail about all these kinds of things in the Olivet Discourse, so get my book when it comes out. Also, check out my website, thebiblefulfilled.com. I have a bunch of free articles and videos about the topics I've discussed in this video. And again, I'm going to put a bunch of these videos and articles in the video notes below. If you're interested, you can check those out. Also, if you like this video, please hit the like button. It'll make it easier for others to find on the search engines. And if you want to be notified of new videos, just hit the subscribe button. Okay, so that is it for today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week.